Stay away from my car. Gabriel Whitmore, billionaire real estate mogul, barked at the homeless man, approaching his dead BMW Y8. The Chicago Marathon had gridlocked downtown, every street choked with barriers. Gabriel glanced at his watch 30 minutes until his most important meeting. His phone showed no drivers available across rideshare apps. "I can fix that," Jerome said calmly, rising from beside a trash can. Gabriel scoffed. "You? Fix a $100,000 car?" But something in the homeless man's steady gaze unsettled him, a quiet confidence completely out of place. Who was this man? How did someone living on streets know about luxury cars? Gabriel was about to discover that first impressions can be dangerously misleading. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt of Fifth Avenue, creating heat waves that shimmered like liquid glass above the chaos of the Chicago Marathon. Gabriel Whitmore adjusted his Italian silk tie for the third time in 5 minutes, his manicured fingers trembling slightly as he checked his platinum Rolex 2:15 p.m. 45 minutes until the most important meeting of his career, and his pride and joy, a gleaming BMW i8, worth more than most people's houses, had just become an expensive paperweight in the worst possible circumstances. The hybrid's sleek butterfly doors remained stubbornly shut, its dashboard as dark as his prospects, while around him, the city had transformed into an impenetrable maze of marathon barriers, security checkpoints, and thousands of spectators cheering on runners who seemed to mock his predicament with their steady progress toward their goals. Gabriel had spent 3 decades clawing his way to the top of Chicago's real estate market, earning a reputation as both brilliant and ruthlessly arrogant, someone who only dealt with people who mattered. He'd built his empire on contingency plans, backup systems, and networks of influential contacts who could solve problems with a single phone call. But today, all of his advantages had evaporated in the face of perfect storm circumstances that no amount of money or influence could overcome. The annual Chicago Marathon had turned downtown into an urban obstacle course, with orange barriers and security perimeters, creating an impenetrable web that trapped him as effectively as any prison. His regular driver had called in sick that morning, leaving Gabriel to navigate the city himself for the first time in years, a decision that now felt catastrophically short-sighted. The transportation apps on his phone told a story of complete systemic failure. Uber showed no drivers available in angry red letters. Lyft displayed an estimated wait time of 150+ minutes due to special event. Even the luxury car services he occasionally used were reporting that their vehicles couldn't penetrate the marathon's security perimeter, which had effectively cut off downtown from the rest of the city. Gabriel had burned through half his phone's battery, making increasingly desperate calls to contacts throughout the city, but everyone gave him the same response. The marathon had created a logistics nightmare that would take hours to resolve. The irony wasn't lost on him that an event celebrating human endurance was now testing his own limits in ways he'd never anticipated, while runners streamed past his disabled vehicle like water around a stone. "I can fix it." The voice emerged from beside a dumpster, gravelly and confident, in a way that immediately grated against Gabriel's frayed nerve. He spun around to see a man who looked like he'd crawled out of society's forgotten corners, wild gray hair that hadn't seen a professional cut in months, a beard that spoke of countless nights sleeping rough, and clothes that might have once been respectable, but now bore the stains and wrinkles of a life lived on the margins. The man's age was difficult to determine beneath the weathered exterior, but something in his posture suggested he was closer to Gabriel's own 50-something years than the decrepit old-timer his appearance initially suggested. What struck Gabriel as most unsettling was the man's eyes sharp, intelligent, completely at odds with his deteriorated appearance, like finding a diamond in a pile of trash. "Are you completely insane?" Gabriel's voice carried the sharp edge of disbelief mixed with mounting panic. This vagrant had the audacity to approach him during the worst crisis of his professional life, speaking as if he possessed solutions that Gabriel's wealth and connections couldn't provide. "I said I can fix it," Jerome repeated, stepping closer with movements that were surprisingly coordinated and purposeful. "BMW i8, hybrid system, probably electrical fault, causing thermal protection shutdown. I know these cars." Gabriel stared at this homeless man who was spouting technical knowledge with casual confidence, the contrast jarring in ways that made his head spin. Here was sophisticated mechanical understanding flowing from someone who looked like he'd been living under a bridge, offering solutions when Gabriel's entire support network had proven useless against the simple combination of mechanical failure and urban logistics. Jerome's reaction to Gabriel's obvious horror and dismissal was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire encounter. He didn't flinch, didn't get angry, didn't react with the wounded pride or defensive hostility Gabriel expected from someone being dismissed based on their appearance. Instead, the man simply nodded slowly, as if Gabriel's response confirmed something he'd been thinking. "I understand," Jerome said quietly, his voice carrying an odd note of patience that made Gabriel feel strangely uncomfortable. "When everything you've learned tells you that worth and wealth are the same thing, it's hard to see past the surface. Success and appearance usually go together in your world." There was no sarcasm in his tone, no bitter edge, just a calm acceptance that somehow made Gabriel feel smaller than any angry retort could have achieved. Gabriel pulled out his phone and began cycling through his contacts again, making increasingly frantic calls to anyone who might be able to help him escape this nightmare. But the marathon had created a perfect storm of circumstances that rendered his usual advantages completely worthless. His assistant couldn't arrange transportation through the security perimeter. His mechanic couldn't reach him through the traffic gridlock. Even his most influential contacts were powerless against the simple logistics of moving a disabled vehicle through a city that had temporarily reorganized itself around a completely different purpose. 25 minutes of travel time to downtown, assuming normal traffic conditions that no longer existed, with no viable alternatives, and time slipping away with each passing second. "Look," Gabriel finally said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic as he ended another unsuccessful call. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I need real solutions from qualified professionals, not some street person who thinks he understands German automotive engineering." Jerome turned back to face him fully, and for a moment, Gabriel caught something in those intelligent eyes that made him deeply uncomfortable. Not anger or hurt, but something that looked disturbingly like pity mixed with genuine concern. "I'm not playing games," Jerome said simply. "I'm offering help. The question is whether your pride is more important than your meeting, and whether you're willing to accept assistance from someone who doesn't look like your usual definition of qualified." The words hit Gabriel like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were delivered with such matter-of-fact gentleness that cut straight through his defensive mechanisms and forced him to confront the choice he was really facing. Jerome moved around the BMW with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining a patient, his weathered hands hovering just above the vehicle's surfaces, as if reading its mechanical distress through some sixth sense. "Samsung SDI 94 kilowatt-hour battery pack," he murmured, more to himself than to Gabriel. "BMS Generation 3 system, thermal runaway protection code, P0A80, triggered by coolant pump overload. Your relay, K47, is probably fried, And you've got a blown fuse in the F-23 position. Gabriel felt his mouth go dry as this homeless man rattled off technical specifications that sounded like they'd come from a BMW service manual. The casual way Jerome spoke about battery management systems and thermal runaway protection suggested a depth of knowledge that went far beyond lucky guessing or overheard conversations. Gabriel's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that street people didn't possess advanced engineering expertise, but the evidence of his own ears was becoming harder to dismiss with each passing second. "Listen," Gabriel said, his voice cracking slightly as he pulled out his phone again. "I don't care what you think you know about cars. I'm calling a real tow service, getting this handled by real professionals." His fingers fumbled across the screen as he dialed Premier Auto Recovery, the same service that had rescued him from minor inconveniences in the past. The conversation that followed felt like a slow-motion disaster. Yes, they could dispatch a truck, but their earliest available slot was 90 minutes away due to a multi-car accident on the expressway. 90 minutes that would put him arriving at the Yamaha Group offices sometime around 4:30, an hour and a half late for the most important meeting of his career. Gabriel ended the call with shaking hands, staring at his phone as if it had personally betrayed him. The mathematics of his situation were brutal and inescapable. He needed to be downtown in 25 minutes, and every conventional solution required more time than he had. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, drawn by the spectacle of an expensive car stopped in the middle of the street, and the unusual sight of a well-dressed businessman apparently arguing with a homeless man. Gabriel felt heat rising in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun as he noticed office workers and pedestrians slowing their pace to observe his predicament. This was exactly the kind of public humiliation he'd spent his entire career avoiding, being seen as vulnerable, helpless, associated with the very people he'd worked so hard to rise above. "Sir, you're blocking traffic," called out a police officer who'd materialized from somewhere in the growing crowd. "I need you to move your vehicle, or we'll have to have it towed." Gabriel's panic ratcheted up another notch as he realized that official intervention would add even more delays to an already impossible timeline. He found himself caught between equally unacceptable alternatives: accept help from someone his every instinct told him to reject, or face the professional disaster of missing the most important meeting of his life. "You're more worried about your image than finding a solution," Jerome observed quietly, his voice carrying an edge of gentle disappointment that somehow cut deeper than any harsh criticism could have. "What does that tell you about your priorities?" Gabriel whipped around to face this insolent vagrant who dared to psychoanalyze him in public. But before he could unleash the angry retort forming on his lips, he watched Jerome do something that stopped him cold. An elderly woman was struggling to cross the busy street with a walker, clearly overwhelmed by the traffic and the crowd. Without hesitation, Jerome approached her respectfully, offered his arm for support, and guided her safely to the opposite sidewalk, his manner gentle and protective despite his rough appearance. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable. While Gabriel stood frozen by his own social anxieties, this homeless man was actively helping someone in need, without concern for how it might look or what he might gain from the gesture. "You judge me by my clothes," Jerome said when he returned, his voice still calm, but now carrying a note of quiet authority that Gabriel found deeply unsettling. "I judge you by how you treat other people. Which one of us do you think sees more clearly?" The words hit Gabriel like a physical blow, not because they were delivered with anger or malice, but because they were spoken with the patient sadness of someone who'd observed this pattern many times before. Gabriel felt his carefully constructed self-image wavering as he realized that this homeless man possessed something he'd never learned despite all his wealth and success, genuine compassion that didn't depend on social status or potential reward. The observation forced Gabriel to confront an uncomfortable truth about himself, about the way he moved through the world, seeing other people primarily as tools for his own advancement or obstacles to be avoided. Jerome's simple act of kindness toward a stranger had revealed more character in 30 seconds than Gabriel typically demonstrated in entire business meetings. The police officer was growing impatient. Other drivers were beginning to honk their horns, and Gabriel's watch showed 2:30 p.m. with merciless precision. 30 minutes until his meeting, and he was no closer to a solution than when this nightmare had begun. His usual resources, money, connections, social influence, felt useless in the face of simple mechanical failure and the ticking clock of time itself. "Last chance," the officer called out. "Move it or lose it." Gabriel found himself looking at Jerome with new eyes, seeing past the rough exterior to something that might be expertise, might be salvation, might be his only remaining option. The homeless man stood patiently beside the BMW, not pushing his offer, not gloating over Gabriel's predicament, simply waiting with the calm confidence of someone who knew his own capabilities, regardless of what others thought. The moment stretched between them like a bridge Gabriel would have to choose whether to cross, knowing that once he took that step, his worldview might never be quite the same. "Fine," Gabriel said finally, the word coming out like a surrender. "You think you can fix it?" "Prove it. But if this is some kind of scam, if you damage my car or waste more of my time—" "It's not a scam," Jerome interrupted gently, "and I won't damage anything. But I'm going to need you to stop thinking of me as a threat and start thinking of me as someone who might actually be able to help you." The simple request carried implications that went far beyond automotive repair, suggesting that the real problem wasn't mechanical failure, but Gabriel's own inability to see value in unexpected places. As Jerome approached the BMW's hood with practiced movements, Gabriel felt the ground shifting beneath everything he thought he knew about success, expertise, and human worth. The crowd pressed closer, turning his personal crisis into a public performance, while somewhere in downtown Chicago, the Yamaha Group executives were probably reviewing their contracts and wondering if their potential American partner had the reliability they were looking for in a business relationship. Jerome's hands moved over the BMW's engine compartment with the reverent care of a master craftsman handling precious materials, his fingers tracing electrical connections and components with an intimacy that spoke of decades spent understanding the language of machines. "Tesla Model S, 12 years as lead engineer for the battery thermal management team," he said quietly, not boasting but simply providing context as he worked. Laid off when they shifted production priorities, restructured the entire engineering division. Wife couldn't handle the stress of unemployment, the uncertainty, divorce, bankruptcy, foreclosure, the usual cascade when your entire identity is tied to a job title and a paycheck. Gabriel found himself leaning closer despite his reservations, drawn by the calm matter-of-factness with which Jerome recounted what must have been a devastating personal collapse. There was no self-pity in his voice, no bitter edge of resentment, just the steady tone of someone who'd processed trauma and emerged with his essential dignity intact. Gabriel realized he was witnessing something rare, genuine resilience born from actual hardship, rather than the performative toughness he'd cultivated in corporate boardrooms. "I lost everything except knowledge and character," Jerome continued, his voice taking on a philosophical weight that seemed at odds with his current circumstances. "Those are the two things money can't buy, and no one can steal from you once you truly possess them." Gabriel felt an uncomfortable stirring of recognition as he watched this homeless man demonstrate more genuine confidence than Gabriel had felt in years of accumulated wealth and success. Jerome's hands never stopped moving as he spoke, methodically checking connections, testing voltage points, diagnosing problems with the systematic approach of someone who understood complex systems from first principles. "Your coolant pump has been overloaded for about 3 hours, probably since you started the car this morning. The thermal protection system did exactly what it was designed to do, shut everything down before you could cause permanent damage to a $90,000 battery pack. BMW engineering at its finest, actually. They built this car to protect itself from owner negligence." Gabriel wanted to argue with the implied criticism, but found himself oddly fascinated by Jerome's diagnostic process and the casual way he discussed engineering concepts that Gabriel had never bothered to understand, despite owning the car for 2 years. "How do you know all this?" Gabriel asked, his voice carrying a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. Jerome looked up from the engine compartment, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been a smile. "Because I helped design the thermal management protocols for hybrid battery systems. Tesla, BMW, Mercedes. We all borrowed from each other's research. Engineering is a collaborative field, despite what the marketing departments want you to believe." Gabriel felt his worldview shifting again as he realized he was talking to someone who'd literally helped create the technology he'd been taking for granted. The contrast between Jerome's current circumstances and his obvious expertise created a cognitive dissonance that challenged everything Gabriel thought he knew about success, failure, and human worth. "I need to apologize," Gabriel said suddenly, the words coming out before he could stop them. But Jerome held up a grease-stained hand, his expression patient but firm. "You're apologizing because you got caught being wrong, not because you were wrong in the first place," Jerome said, with gentle accuracy that made Gabriel wince. "Real change happens when you understand why you made the mistake, not just when you feel bad about getting caught making it." Gabriel found himself speechless, confronted by a level of psychological insight that cut straight through his defensive mechanisms. This homeless man was reading him like a technical manual, identifying his character flaws with the same systematic precision he'd used to diagnose the car's problems. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. If Jerome could see through him so easily, how many other people had Gabriel underestimated or dismissed based on equally superficial judgments? "Here's what I've learned about success," Jerome said, returning his attention to the engine while continuing to speak in that calm, instructional tone that somehow made his words impossible to dismiss. "Real success isn't about climbing higher than other people. It's about lifting others up with you, creating value that extends beyond your own immediate interests. I spent years thinking my engineering genius made me special, made me better than people in lesser jobs. Took losing everything to realize that human worth doesn't come from what you do for a living or how much money you make." Gabriel felt something shift in his chest as Jerome articulated truths that Gabriel had spent his entire career running from. The homeless man's words carried the authority of someone who'd tested these principles against actual hardship and emerged with his essential humanity intact. Gabriel realized he was receiving a masterclass in philosophy from someone society had written off as a failure, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Jerome's initial repair attempt hit an immediate snag when he discovered that the nearest electronics store didn't carry the specific 15-amp fuse required for the BMW's electrical system. They only had 10-amp alternatives that wouldn't handle the current load safely. "Wrong amperage rating could cause a fire or damage other components," Jerome explained, as they stood outside the small shop, Gabriel's desperation mounting with each passing minute. "We need to find another solution, or wait for the right part to be delivered." Gabriel felt panic rising as his watch showed 2:45 p.m., leaving him with 15 minutes to somehow solve this problem and still make his meeting on time. The ticking clock seemed to mock his helplessness as he realized that all his wealth and connections couldn't accelerate the basic logistics of finding the right component for a repair. Jerome studied Gabriel's face with the same analytical attention he'd given the car's engine, reading stress levels and decision-making patterns with practiced ease. "You're calculating whether to risk using the wrong fuse or accept missing your meeting," Jerome observed with unsettling accuracy. "Both choices feel unacceptable, so you're looking for a third option that doesn't exist." Gabriel stared at this homeless man who seemed capable of reading his mind, wondering how someone who'd lost everything could possess such clarity about human nature and decision-making under pressure. "The Yamaha Group doesn't reschedule meetings," Gabriel said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled desperation. "This deal represents 3 years of development work, $500 million in potential revenue. If I miss this appointment, I lose everything I've worked for." Jerome nodded thoughtfully, but his expression remained calm in a way that somehow made Gabriel feel even more agitated. "So, your entire career, your sense of self-worth, your financial security, all of it, depends on making this one meeting," Jerome said. "That's either incredibly focused planning or a fundamental misunderstanding of how sustainable success actually works." The observation hit Gabriel like cold water, forcing him to confront the precarious foundation upon which he'd built his entire life. He'd created a system where a single mechanical failure could destroy decades of work, where his self-worth depended entirely on external validation and financial outcomes. Jerome, who'd lost everything and somehow maintained his essential dignity, was offering a perspective on success that Gabriel had never considered. As they stood outside the electronics store with an unfixable car and an unmovable deadline, Gabriel found himself facing questions that went far deeper than automotive repair. What did it mean to build a life that could be destroyed by something as simple as a blown fuse? And why did this homeless man seem more genuinely confident and secure than Gabriel had felt in years of accumulated wealth and professional achievement? The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly as time slipped away, carrying with it not just Gabriel's immediate plans, but possibly his entire understanding of what it meant to live a successful life. "Jerome Thompson," the voice cut through the ambient street noise like a bell, carrying a note of professional recognition that made both men turn. A woman in her early 40s approached them, with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, her BMW credentials badge catching the sunlight as she moved. Dr. Penelope Walsh carried herself with the natural authority of someone who'd earned her position through technical competence rather than political maneuvering. Her graying hair pulled back in a practical style that suggested she spent more time in laboratories than boardrooms. Gabriel recognized the type immediately, the kind of engineering executive who could discuss quantum mechanics over lunch and still make deadline-driven business decisions in the afternoon. Her presence felt like a disruption in the fabric of reality, a professional from Gabriel's world materializing in the middle of his personal crisis to confirm something that shouldn't have been possible. "Dr. Walsh," Jerome said simply, his voice carrying the warm recognition of professional respect rather than the desperate eagerness Gabriel would have expected from someone in his circumstances. "I didn't know BMW had operations in Chicago." Gabriel watched this exchange with growing astonishment, noting the easy familiarity between these two people who represented opposite ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. Dr. Walsh's expression shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching reverence as she fully registered Jerome's identity. "You're the author of Thermal Management in High-Density Battery Packs," she said, her voice taking on the tone reserved for meeting intellectual heroes. Your work on phase change cooling systems revolutionized how we approach battery thermal design. I've cited your research probably 50 times in the last 3 years. Gabriel felt his understanding of reality cracking like ice under pressure as he realized he'd been dismissing someone whose expertise was apparently legendary within the automotive engineering community. The validation was swift, comprehensive, and utterly devastating to Gabriel's preconceptions. Dr. Walsh explained that Jerome had been considered one of the leading minds in electric vehicle thermal management, that his departure from Tesla had been felt throughout the industry, that his theoretical work continued to influence design decisions at major automotive companies worldwide. Tesla was paying you what? $300,000 a year? Dr. Walsh asked, her tone suggesting this was common knowledge within their professional circle. Plus stock options that would have made you independently wealthy if you'd stayed through the IPO. Gabriel found himself staring at Jerome with completely different eyes, seeing not a homeless failure, but a recognized genius whose expertise commanded respect from the highest levels of automotive engineering. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could someone of such obvious professional value end up living on the streets? Sometimes life doesn't follow the trajectory you expect, Jerome said. When Dr. Walsh expressed surprise at his current circumstances. Personal choices, bad timing, economic forces beyond individual control. The market doesn't always reward the best people, and success isn't always a reflection of competence or character. Gabriel felt these words like physical blows, each one challenging assumptions he'd built his entire worldview around. He'd always believed that financial success was a direct measure of personal worth, that poverty was primarily the result of individual failures rather than systemic problems or unfortunate circumstances. Jerome's calm acceptance of his situation, combined with Dr. Walsh's obvious professional respect, forced Gabriel to confront the possibility that his understanding of merit and reward was fundamentally flawed. If someone this talented could lose everything, what did that say about the nature of success itself? Dr. Walsh offered to call her BMW service team to handle the repair, but Jerome declined with the same patient dignity he'd shown throughout this encounter. I told Mr. Whitmore I could fix his car, and I intend to keep that promise, Jerome said. Besides, the learning experience is probably more valuable than a quick solution. Gabriel realized that Jerome was still focused on helping him, despite receiving validation that could have shifted the entire dynamic of their relationship. Most people in Jerome's position would have used Dr. Walsh's arrival as leverage, as proof of their worth that demanded different treatment. Instead, Jerome remained committed to his original offer of assistance, treating Gabriel's crisis as genuinely important, regardless of how Gabriel had initially treated him. The generosity of spirit in this approach left Gabriel feeling smaller and more ashamed than any angry confrontation could have achieved. The problem isn't just mechanical, Jerome explained to Dr. Walsh as they examined the BMW together, their conversation full of technical terminology that flew over Gabriel's head. Mr. Whitmore needs to understand that sustainable success comes from building systems that can handle unexpected failures, not from creating single points of failure and hoping nothing goes wrong. Gabriel found himself listening to a discussion that was ostensibly about automotive repair, but was really about life philosophy, business strategy, and the fundamental principles of resilience. Jerome and Dr. Walsh spoke about redundancy systems, failure mode analysis, and graceful degradation concepts that Gabriel realized applied as much to career planning as to engineering design. He'd built his entire professional life as a single-threaded system with no backup plans, no graceful degradation, no redundancy systems to handle unexpected failures. Gabriel's transformation began with a simple realization. He'd just witnessed someone of undeniable expertise choose compassion over vindication, service over self-interest, dignity over revenge. Jerome could have used Dr. Walsh's arrival to humiliate Gabriel, to prove his worth by highlighting Gabriel's ignorance and prejudice. Instead, he'd continued to focus on solving Gabriel's problem with the same patient professionalism he'd shown from the beginning. "I was wrong about you," Gabriel said finally, the words feeling inadequate to express the magnitude of his misjudgment. "Completely, embarrassingly wrong." Jerome looked at him with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through surface appearances to underlying character. "The question isn't whether you were wrong," Jerome said gently. "The question is whether you understand why you were wrong and what you're going to do with that understanding." Dr. Walsh's presence had shifted the entire dynamic of their interaction, transforming Jerome from a homeless vagabond into a recognized expert whose professional credentials commanded respect. But Gabriel realized that Jerome himself hadn't changed at all. His knowledge, his character, his dignity had been constant throughout their encounter. The only thing that had changed was Gabriel's ability to see past his own prejudices, to recognize value that had been there all along. "How many talented people have I dismissed?" Gabriel asked, the question emerging as much from genuine self-reflection as from conversational necessity. "How many opportunities have I missed because I was too busy judging by appearances to recognize actual competence?" Jerome's expression softened, with something that might have been approval, as he recognized that Gabriel was asking the right questions, beginning to understand that this encounter was about something much larger than automotive repair. As Dr. Walsh prepared to leave, exchanging professional contact information with Jerome and expressing hope that he'd consider returning to the industry, Gabriel found himself experiencing a profound shift in perspective. The homeless man he'd initially dismissed as a threat to his dignity had turned out to be someone whose expertise was recognized and respected by leaders in one of the world's most technically demanding industries. The revelation forced Gabriel to confront uncomfortable truths about his own judgment, his values, and the superficial criteria he'd been using to evaluate human worth. Standing there on the sidewalk with 10 minutes until his crucial meeting, Gabriel realized that Jerome had already given him something more valuable than automotive repair, a lesson in humility that might fundamentally change how he moved through the world. Jerome moved into full engineering mode with the fluid precision of a surgeon beginning a complex operation, his weathered hands transforming from those of a homeless vagrant into the skilled instruments of a master craftsman. "First lesson," he said, as he began to methodically disassemble the BMW's electrical system. "Knowledge shared multiplies rather than diminishes. Want to learn how this really works?" Gabriel found himself nodding eagerly, his earlier prejudices completely overwhelmed by curiosity about Jerome's obvious expertise. The homeless man's approach to the repair was like watching a technical ballet, every movement deliberate, every action building upon the previous one in a carefully orchestrated sequence that demonstrated decades of experience with complex systems. Gabriel had expected mechanical fumbling from someone living on the streets. Instead, he was witnessing a masterclass in automotive engineering delivered by someone who clearly understood these systems at a fundamental level. "BM uses a distributed electrical architecture," Jerome explained, as he carefully removed panels to access the car's electronic control units, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone who'd taught complex concepts to countless students over the years. 12 separate modules communicating through a CAN bus network, each one monitoring specific systems and reporting status to the central gateway. Your thermal protection shutdown isn't just a single failure. It's a coordinated response involving the battery management system, the thermal control module, and the power distribution center working together to prevent catastrophic damage. Gabriel watched in fascination as Jerome identified and tested individual components with tools he'd somehow produced from his worn clothing, measuring voltage levels and resistance values with the systematic approach of someone who understood not just what to check, but why each measurement mattered. The contrast between Jerome's rough appearance and his sophisticated technical knowledge created a cognitive dissonance that forced Gabriel to question every assumption he'd ever made about the relationship between expertise and social status. The crowd that had gathered earlier now pressed closer, drawn by the unusual spectacle of what appeared to be a homeless man performing complex automotive surgery, while a well-dressed businessman watched with rapt attention. Several onlookers had begun filming with their phones, turning Jerome's repair work into an impromptu viral moment that captured something profound about hidden talent and unexpected expertise. "This is why I do this work," Jerome said quietly, noting Gabriel's awareness of their audience. "Not to prove anything to you or to them, but because when you can do something well, you should do it. Recognition and reward are secondary considerations. The work itself is the primary value." Gabriel felt something shift in his understanding as he realized he was witnessing a demonstration of intrinsic motivation that was completely foreign to his own experience. Every action Gabriel took was calculated for its impact on his reputation, his financial position, his social standing. Jerome was working solely because the work was worth doing, regardless of external validation or material reward. Electrical resistance 0.02 ohms, current load 12.5 amperes, safety factor 1.2. Jerome narrated as he fabricated a temporary fuse using copper wire and electrical tape, his improvised solution demonstrating the kind of practical engineering that could only come from deep understanding of underlying principles. Not elegant, but functionally equivalent to the factory component and safe within operating parameters. Gabriel watched this homeless man create a custom electrical component using materials that cost less than $5, solving a problem that Gabriel's wealth and connections had been powerless to address. The irony was profound. All of Gabriel's accumulated resources meant nothing in the face of a simple mechanical failure, while Jerome's knowledge and skill could create solutions from virtually nothing. Gabriel began to understand that he'd been confusing wealth with capability, social status with actual competence, financial success with genuine value creation. "Here's what they don't teach you in business school," Jerome continued as he carefully reassembled the electrical connections, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd performed these operations thousands of times. "Real value comes from solving problems that matter to other people, not from accumulating symbols of success that only matter to yourself. I could charge you $500 for this repair, pocket the money, and feel good about extracting maximum value from your desperation. Instead, I'm giving you something more valuable understanding of how these systems actually work, and maybe some insight into how success and worth really function in the world." Gabriel felt the words penetrating defenses he'd built over decades of competitive business practice, challenging core assumptions about value, pricing, and the nature of economic exchange. Jerome was offering education instead of exploitation, knowledge instead of mere service, transformation instead of transaction. The BMW's engine came to life with a smooth hum that drew spontaneous applause from the gathered crowd, the successful repair transforming Jerome from a curious street performer into something approaching a folk hero. But Gabriel noticed that Jerome showed no triumph, no satisfaction at having proven his expertise to skeptical observers. Instead, he simply closed the hood with the same methodical care he'd shown throughout the repair process, treating the successful outcome as the natural result of applying proper knowledge and technique rather than as a personal victory worth celebrating. "You just taught me how to be human," Gabriel said, the words emerging with more honesty than he'd intended. Jerome looked at him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through surface appearances to underlying character. "You always had the capacity," Jerome replied. "I just showed you how to access it. The real question is what you'll do with that knowledge now that you have it." Gabriel felt pride swelling in his chest, but realized with surprise that it wasn't pride in himself or his possessions. It was pride in Jerome's accomplishment, satisfaction at witnessing genuine expertise applied with generosity and skill. The emotional shift was profound and unsettling. For the first time in memory, Gabriel was experiencing vicarious rather than self-centered satisfaction. "How long since you felt genuinely proud of someone else's success, without calculating what it meant for your own position?" Jerome asked, his observation cutting straight to the heart of Gabriel's emotional experience. Gabriel realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd celebrated another person's achievement without immediately analyzing how it affected his own competitive standing. Jerome's question revealed a fundamental poverty in Gabriel's emotional life that all his financial wealth had never addressed. The repair was complete with 7 minutes to spare before Gabriel's crucial meeting, the timing so precise it seemed almost magical rather than merely competent. But as Gabriel prepared to rush off to his appointment, he found himself reluctant to leave this extraordinary homeless man who demonstrated more genuine expertise and character in one afternoon than Gabriel typically encountered in months of business meetings. "The meeting you're rushing to," Jerome said, as if reading Gabriel's thoughts. "Will it create value for people beyond yourself? Or is it just another transaction designed to concentrate wealth without creating genuine benefit?" The question stopped Gabriel cold, as he realized he'd never seriously considered whether his business activities actually contributed to human welfare, or simply moved money from one set of wealthy investors to another. Jerome had managed to challenge not just Gabriel's immediate crisis, but the fundamental purpose and meaning of his entire professional life, all while fixing a car with improvised tools and homeless shelter clothes. Gabriel arrived at the Yamaha Group offices with 2 minutes to spare, his BMW purring with the smooth efficiency that only perfect engineering could provide. But his mind was entirely occupied with thoughts of the extraordinary homeless man who'd made this meeting possible. The conference room overlooked Lake Michigan, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that usually filled Gabriel with satisfaction about his position in the city's commercial hierarchy. Today, however, he found himself thinking about Jerome sitting somewhere on the streets below, possessing more genuine expertise and character than anyone in this polished corporate environment. The irony wasn't lost on Gabriel that he was about to close the biggest deal of his career while mentally comparing these wealthy executives unfavorably to a man who owned nothing but the clothes on his back. The Marina Bay Resort project sailed through approval with the kind of smooth efficiency that Gabriel had always attributed to his own brilliance, but now recognized as the predictable result of thorough preparation meeting favorable market conditions. The $50 million profit from the Yamaha Group deal should have felt like vindication, like proof of Gabriel's business acumen and strategic thinking. Instead, it felt hollow and somehow unearned, tainted by his growing awareness that financial success often had more to do with favorable circumstances than personal merit. As he shook hands with Japanese executives and exchanged pleasantries about future collaborations, Gabriel found himself wondering what Jerome was doing at that exact moment. whether he was helping another stranded motorist or sharing his engineering knowledge with someone else who needed assistance. The contrast between the sterile corporate environment and Jerome's authentic human connection made Gabriel feel like he was playing a role in someone else's life, rather than living his own authentic existence. Every congratulatory comment from the Yamaha Group representatives reminded Gabriel that his success had been made possible by someone society had written off as worthless. Gabriel's first instinct after leaving the meeting was to find Jerome and offer him some kind of reward money, a job, something tangible that would assuage Gabriel's guilt and restore his sense of control over the situation. But as he drove through Chicago's downtown streets, looking for the homeless man who'd saved his career, Gabriel realized he had no idea where to begin searching. Jerome had appeared like a guardian angel during Gabriel's moment of crisis, and then vanished back into the city's invisible population of forgotten people. The search took Gabriel into neighborhoods he'd never visited, despite living in Chicago for 20 years, past homeless shelters and soup kitchens and social service centers that existed in a parallel universe to his world of luxury condominiums and exclusive restaurants. For the first time in his adult life, Gabriel was actively seeking out the places where society's unsuccessful gathered, driven by a need to find someone who demonstrated more genuine success than Gabriel had ever achieved. He finally located Jerome in a makeshift encampment under a highway overpass, living in a carefully organized space that somehow managed to feel dignified despite its obvious poverty. What struck Gabriel most powerfully was that Jerome wasn't alone. He was surrounded by other homeless individuals to whom he was clearly teaching automotive repair and basic electrical work, sharing his expertise with people who had even fewer resources than he did. Gabriel watched from a distance as Jerome patiently explained engine diagnostics to a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, noting how the older man's teaching style combined technical precision with genuine encouragement. The scene challenged every assumption Gabriel had ever made about homeless communities, revealing a hidden economy of knowledge, sharing, and mutual support that operated according to completely different principles than the competitive business world Gabriel knew. "Mr. Whitmore," Jerome said when he noticed Gabriel's approach, his voice carrying the same calm dignity it had during their earlier encounter. "I wondered if you'd come looking." Gabriel felt suddenly awkward and out of place in his expensive suit, surrounded by people whose material poverty highlighted his own spiritual impoverishment. "I wanted to thank you," Gabriel began, but Jerome raised a hand to stop him. "You don't need to thank me for doing what was right," Jerome said simply. "But if you really want to show appreciation, tell me what you learned from our encounter. Not what you think I want to hear, but what actually changed in your understanding of how the world works." Gabriel found himself facing the kind of honest self-examination that had been completely absent from his life until this afternoon, forced to articulate insights that challenged everything he'd believed about success, worth, and human value. "I learned that I've been confusing wealth with worth," Gabriel said slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "That I've built my entire sense of self around accumulating things that don't actually matter, while ignoring the qualities that make someone genuinely valuable." Jerome nodded thoughtfully, his weathered face showing the patient attention of someone who'd heard many confessions, but still found each one worthy of consideration. "Those are good insights," Jerome said, "but insights without action are just intellectual exercises. What are you going to do differently?" The question hit Gabriel like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the gap between understanding and implementation, between recognizing problems and actually solving them. Gabriel realized that Jerome was still teaching him, still pushing him toward growth and self-improvement, even though their immediate crisis had been resolved. Gabriel's offer of a chief technology officer position with a $500,000 salary was met with the same patient dignity Jerome had shown throughout their encounter. "You still don't understand," Jerome said gently, his refusal delivered without anger or resentment. "I'm rich in ways that your money can't measure and can't purchase. I have purpose, community, the satisfaction of using my skills to help people who actually need assistance." Then Gabriel stared at this homeless man who was turning down more money than most people made in 5 years, trying to process the idea that someone could voluntarily choose poverty over wealth. "You have the capability to change many people's lives," Jerome continued, "but you're wasting it on projects that only make rich people richer. What kind of legacy is that? What kind of impact are you actually having on the world?" The conversation shifted Gabriel's understanding of success from accumulation to contribution, from personal achievement to social impact. Jerome revealed that he'd been watching Gabriel for months, researching his business practices and development projects, trying to understand whether Gabriel was someone who might be capable of growth and change. "I don't need your money," Jerome said with quiet authority. "I need your resources, your connections, your ability to make things happen at scale. But only if you're willing to use those advantages for something more meaningful than personal enrichment." Gabriel felt something fundamental shifting in his worldview as he realized that Jerome had been evaluating him just as thoroughly as Gabriel had been judging Jerome, but using completely different criteria. Where Gabriel had seen failure and worthlessness, Jerome had seen potential and possibility. But potential that would only be realized if Gabriel could transcend his own limitations and embrace a larger vision of what success might look like. As the afternoon sun began to set over Chicago, casting long shadows across the makeshift community under the overpass, Gabriel found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could return to his comfortable existence, using his newfound humility as a private virtue, while continuing to operate according to the same competitive principles that had brought him financial success. Or he could take Jerome's challenge seriously, using his resources and capabilities to create value that extended beyond his own immediate interests. The homeless man who'd saved his career was offering him something far more valuable than automotive repair, a chance to transform his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Gabriel realized that Jerome had not only fixed his car, but had also identified the fundamental mechanical failure in Gabriel's approach to existence itself. "Tech for humanity," Gabriel said the words aloud for the first time, testing how they felt in his mouth as he stood in Jerome's makeshift community, surrounded by people who represented everything he'd spent his life trying to rise above. "We use the profit from the Marina Bay deal to build a comprehensive training center for displaced engineers, unemployed technical workers, anyone with skills who just needs an opportunity to demonstrate their worth." Jerome listened with the patient attention he'd shown throughout their encounter, but Gabriel could see something new in his expression. Cautious hope mixed with analytical skepticism. "There are 15,000 unemployed engineers in Chicago alone," Gabriel continued, his voice growing more confident as the vision crystallized. "People with advanced degrees working minimum wage jobs. People whose expertise is being wasted because of age discrimination, economic downturns, industry consolidation. We could change that. We could create a system that recognizes talent regardless of circumstances." Jerome studied Gabriel's face with the same diagnostic intensity he'd brought to the BMW's engine problems, looking for signs of genuine commitment versus superficial enthusiasm. Now you're beginning to understand, Jerome said slowly. But are you proposing this because it's the right thing to do, or because you want to feel better about yourself? Because sustainable change requires authentic motivation, not just guilty conscience. Gabriel felt the familiar sting of Jerome's psychological insight, recognizing that the homeless man was still teaching him, still pushing him toward deeper self-awareness, even as they discussed practical solutions to systemic problems. Both, Gabriel admitted, with surprising honesty. I want to feel better about how I've lived my life, but I also think this could actually work. I have the resources, the connections, the ability to make something like this happen at scale. But I'd need you to run it, to ensure we're actually helping people instead of just creating another corporate charity that makes donors feel good without changing anything fundamental. The negotiations that followed were unlike any business discussion Gabriel had ever experienced, conducted not in a boardroom, but in a homeless encampment, focused not on profit margins, but on social impact. Jerome's conditions were specific and non-negotiable. The program would be run by people who'd actually experienced unemployment and displacement, not corporate executives with good intentions. Participants would be paid living wages while training, not treated as charity cases. Grateful for any assistance, the curriculum would focus on practical skills and immediate employment opportunities, not theoretical knowledge that sounded impressive but didn't translate to actual jobs. Gabriel found himself agreeing to terms that would have seemed impossible in his previous life, recognizing that Jerome's demands came from deep understanding of what actually helped people versus what merely appeared helpful to outside observers. You're essentially asking me to fund a revolution in how we think about employment, education, and human worth, Gabriel said as they walked through the encampment, Jerome introducing him to individuals whose stories challenged every assumption Gabriel had made about success and failure. There was Maria, a former aerospace engineer who'd been blacklisted for whistleblowing about safety violations. Robert, a software developer whose age made him unemployable despite 40 years of experience. Jennifer, a mechanical engineer whose autism spectrum disorder made traditional job interviews impossible despite her extraordinary technical abilities. Each person Jerome introduced possessed obvious competence and dignity, their current circumstances reflecting systemic failures rather than personal inadequacies. Gabriel began to understand that Jerome's community wasn't just a collection of unfortunate individuals, but a reservoir of wasted human potential that society had discarded based on superficial criteria. 6 months later, Gabriel stood in the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Chicago Technical Renaissance Center, a $10 million facility that had become a model for skills-based training programs across the country. Jerome had insisted on the name, explaining that Renaissance meant rebirth, renewal, the rediscovery of forgotten knowledge and capabilities. The center occupied a renovated warehouse in an industrial district, its interior filled with state-of-the-art equipment and training stations, where unemployed engineers worked alongside recent graduates, sharing knowledge and building the kind of collaborative community that traditional corporate structures rarely fostered. Gabriel watched Jerome move through the facility with obvious pride, not in ownership, but in the authentic satisfaction of seeing skilled people regain their sense of purpose and dignity. The program had already placed 200 participants in technical positions, but more importantly, it had begun to change how Chicago's technology sector thought about hiring and human potential. Gabriel Whitmore, Engineer of the Year, Jerome read from the award notification that had arrived that morning, his voice carrying gentle amusement at the title. They're recognizing you for innovative approaches to technical education and workforce development. How does it feel to be famous for something that actually matters? Gabriel felt a complex mixture of pride and embarrassment as he realized that his greatest professional recognition had come not from accumulating wealth, but from giving it away. Not from competing with others, but from lifting them up. The irony wasn't lost on him that an award ceremony celebrating his humanitarian work would be attended by the same corporate executives who'd previously valued him only for his ability to generate profit. Jerome had fundamentally changed not just Gabriel's business practices, but his entire understanding of what constituted meaningful achievement. The email that arrived during the celebration ceremony seemed almost too perfect to be real. NASA was requesting Jerome's consultation on thermal management systems for their new Mars exploration vehicles, offering a six-figure contract for work that would once again put his expertise at the center of cutting-edge technological development. Gabriel watched Jerome read the message with the same calm dignity he'd shown throughout their relationship, noting that the homeless man's reaction to potentially life-changing opportunity was characteristically measured and thoughtful. "Interesting," Jerome said simply, handing the phone back to Gabriel. "But I think I'm exactly where I need to be right now. There are still 300 people on our waiting list, and Maria is ready to start teaching the advanced aerospace systems curriculum. Sometimes the most important work isn't the most prestigious work." Gabriel felt something profound settle in his chest as he realized that Jerome had once again demonstrated a principle that Gabriel was still learning to internalize, that true success came from choosing purpose over prestige, impact over income, service over self-aggrandizement. The homeless man who'd saved Gabriel's career by fixing his car had ultimately saved Gabriel's life by fixing his understanding of what it meant to live with dignity and purpose. Standing in the training center, surrounded by people whose skills were finally being recognized and valued, Gabriel understood that Jerome had given him something infinitely more valuable than automotive repair. He'd given him a roadmap for becoming the kind of person Gabriel had always had the potential to be, but had never known how to access. As the evening celebration wound down and participants began to head home to families and apartments they could now afford thanks to their renewed employment, Gabriel found himself alone with Jerome in the quiet facility. "Thank you," Gabriel said simply, the words carrying the weight of 6 months of transformation and growth. Jerome looked at him with those penetrating eyes that had seen through Gabriel's defenses from their first encounter. "You always had this capacity," Jerome replied, echoing the words he'd spoken that first afternoon. "I just showed you how to see it. The real question is what you'll do next, how you'll continue growing, how you'll keep finding ways to serve something larger than yourself." Gabriel realized that Jerome was still teaching him, still pushing him toward continued development and self-improvement, still refusing to let him settle for easy answers or comfortable complacency. Sometimes the greatest teachers appear in the most unexpected forms. Jerome didn't just fix Gabriel's car, he repaired something fundamental in Gabriel's understanding of human worth. The homeless man's dignity and expertise revealed a truth no business school teaches. Real value comes from what we contribute to others, not what we accumulate for ourselves. True wealth is measured in purpose and community, not possessions. Gabriel's transformation demonstrates the profound change possible when we see past appearances to recognize extraordinary potential in unexpected places. Real success isn't about proving superiority. It's about using our advantages to create a world where everyone's talents are valued. How many remarkable people have you dismissed based on circumstances? The most important lessons often come from the most unlikely teachers.